I first met Rupert when I went up to Cumbria sometime last year. And then I started to see what he did, which I think was quite spectacular, actually, facing down some absolutely appalling treatment by the media during the rebellion.
Change is coming, we are few, but we are strong.
Disrupting people's travel, causing the chaos outside this building here is wrong.
In fact, the police say it will be illegal to try and run through any groups of protesters.
You and your like are a stain upon the city.
Bad things will happen.
I think
Sling your hook.
That is wrong.
You held the space in a dignified and informed way, which put them to shame, actually, I have to say.
Extinction Rebellion is not about blaming individuals for what they do. It's about us all working together to turn this around. Only because these radical means have been taken that we're actually having this conversation at all. And everyone knows that we have right on our side on this issue. Pretty much everyone. This is the issue on which our children will judge us. And if we don't get it right, we will be judged.
Change is coming, we are few, but we are strong. Time's been wasted, and we haven't got too long.
For the benefit of the few of you who haven't watched the film, very, very briefly, let me just tell you the sort of takeaways from that film in case you haven't seen it. So the basic one is that this civilization is finished. And what I mean by that is that the only way that we are going to get through this crisis without there being some kind of collapse event is if we completely transform everything. So much so that it wouldn't be recognizable as this civilization anymore. And I think that telling the truth is such an incredibly powerful thing. Gandhi called it truth force. That was the name he gave to his method of nonviolent direct action. He thought that the force of the truth was the same thing as nonviolent resistance. And I think that one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion has been so successful so far is our absolute discipline in nonviolence. And we could talk about that. And what I argue towards the latter part of the talk, the climate catastrophe talk, is that we need transformative adaptation and we need deep adaptation. We need adaptation, that is, which is going to try to transform our society completely away from this civilization to something different. And we need deep adaptation that is premised on the probability of collapse. We need to be ready for the likelihood that we will fail to do enough. Because it's way too late to have a mitigation-centric only approach now. It's way too late to say we can stop the climate disasters from happening. No, there are going to be climate disasters happening. They're going to get worse for a long time. We might manage to turn things around, but if we do, it will be in a world which has been partly degraded, and therefore we cannot get away any longer without having a heavy focus on adaptation as well as mitigation. And what I also said in the film is that because of all this, we have very little left to lose. And so there's a great moral imperative upon us to rebel, to not go along with the ordinary rules of the game any longer. So what's happened since I gave that talk? I gave that talk that was recorded a few months ago in February. Well, a number of things have happened since then. One thing is that the IPCC has started to wake up even further to the reality that we need to face up to. And the UN system has started to wake up further to that. So there's been the report on Arctic melting and the degradation of the Arctic system and the effects of that on climate, which was ignored essentially in the 1.5 degree report. The 1.5 degree report last autumn was the best thing that the IPCC had ever done, but it was still way too optimistic. It was still way too conservative because it didn't include what's happening in the Arctic. It didn't include the feedback effects. They're now starting to bring that in. We've had the release of the IPBES report. Some of you may not be fully aware of that. It's massively, massively important. IPBES is for biodiversity what the IPCC is for climate. And the IPBES report came out and said, we're headed towards extinguishing 1 million species. Of course, actually, we really have no idea how many we're heading towards extinguishing because we have no idea, really, how many species there are on this planet. Our biological and ecological knowledge is way, way less than our knowledge of physics and chemistry. We know in a certain sense more about what's going on in the Andromeda galaxy than we do on the Earth. We don't know how many species we are extinguishing every day. People say, well, it's about 200, but it might be a lot less than that. It might be a lot more than that. Anyway, the IPBES report said we're in real trouble on biodiversity. Other species are going extinct right now at an unprecedented rate, and that curve is going up. And people are starting to wake up to that issue and to realize that it is a climate and ecological emergency, and not that the focus on climate alone is not enough. What else has happened since I gave that talk? We've had some more crazy weather. You remember when we had summer in February? And now we've got a sort of somewhat wintry summer here, but in the Arctic it's going absolutely crazy again, and they've had temperatures of up to 30 degrees. Really, it's very scary indeed. One other thing has happened since I gave that talk, which is that talk looked forward to the Extinction Rebellion International rebellion and urged people to rebel, and bloody hell, we did. And it's a historic event, what happens in April. I mean, it is a historic event. It will be part of our history, if there is any history that gets written of the 21st century. How did it happen? How did we manage to create this enormous shift in consciousness? Well, that's something I'd love to discuss with you. I'm just going to say a couple of quick things about what I think happened now to sort of start the ball rolling on that a bit. So at the start of the International Rebellion in mid-April, the media basically threw everything they had at us. And for the first couple of days, it was pretty hard going. And the police also threw a fair bit at us. I mean, we could talk about the very fascinating and important fact that it didn't seem some of the time as though the heart of the police was fully in what they were being told to do. And there's all sorts of wonderful anecdotes about people making positive contacts with the police and so on. But, you know, make no mistake, the police did come quite close to breaking us at Waterloo Bridge, which in those first couple of days, which could have been extremely significant. And, you know, some people say, well, maybe they deliberately didn't. I don't think we know or anybody knows. I'm disinclined to believe that, actually. I think we had a bit of luck sometimes in the first few days, and we were also incredibly organized and determined, and it was so beautiful and powerful to be a part of. I know that a lot of you were there. I know it's a hell of a long way from here to London. But one little thing I do want to say to you this evening is I do think it's really important that we, in places like Cornwall and in places like Norfolk, where I'm from, as well as doing our local organising and making stuff happen where we are, that we participate in the stuff that's going on nationally. Because there's a reason that revolutions and rebellions typically centre on capital cities. It's because that's where the media is centred, that's where obviously the government is centred. And ultimately, you do need to do stuff there in a big way if you're going to get transformative change, which is exactly what we need. We got through those first few days and we kept on with beautiful performances of people in the media, beautiful heroism in the streets. The attitude of people in London, I think, started to shift. For example, you know, a lot of people experience, a lot of commuters experience, cyclists, people who take trains in and out of London and so on, experience what was happening on Waterloo Bridge and thought, oh, it's actually really lovely, you know? It's got all these plants on it, and it's quiet, and it's not full of diesel fumes, and these people actually seem quite reasonable, and they're not all hippies. Actually, isn't it really sad that hippie is such an insult? Now, I was hearing the other day of young kids who apparently say things like, oh, wow, that sunset's really nice, but I'm not a hippie. You know, that's something really sad about that deserves further thought and attention. And as the rebellion went on, and as people, I think, breathed a sigh of relief that they weren't having to talk all the time 24/7 about Brexit for once, we managed to start having conversations in the media which were more substantive and not just about how dare you disrupt the traffic kind of thing, but were actually about the issues. And sometime around the end of that first week, the start of that second week, the mood really started to shift. It was helped, of course, by Greta Thunberg's visit to Britain. I was there at the Guardian Live event. I asked her, do you support Extinction Rebellion? She said, yes. The stuff that she did while she was here was very, very helpful to us. And she cemented Michael Gove's commitment to meet with us. He had already made that commitment in private, but she made him say it in public. And it was also very fortuitous, of course, that David Attenborough's excellent documentary, Climate Change, The Facts, the BBC have been waking up over the last year to this issue, and that was another step in the right direction for them, that aired at the same time. But primarily what I think it was that our sacrifice, our extreme non-violent discipline, and the chance to gradually get more and more chances in the media to actually talk with people and show ourselves in reality, telling the truth, being real, being emotional sometimes about what's happening and so on. We wore down, as it were, the resistance, and more people started to think something like, well, I'm not sure I entirely like Extinction Rebellion, but by God, they've got a point, and they're making us talk about this, and they're making us think about this, and we need to. And so during that second week, we had all sorts of incredible developments, like, for example, the letter by business leaders to the Times, which said, we support Extinction Rebellion. You know, not just something like, Extinction Rebellion have got some interesting points, and yeah, we need to think about emissions a bit more, but we support Extinction Rebellion. Remarkable article by William Hague saying, if the Conservatives don't wake up to climate, they're going to be stuffed as an electoral force. And so on and so forth. The week after the rebellion was paused at the end of April, we met with Michael Gove, we met with Sadiq Khan, we met with John McDonnell, and so on and so forth. Those meetings are going on. And the effects of the rebellion are going on and going on and going on. They're reverberating around, mostly symbolic, but also some real. For example, the change in flight duty in Scotland. That policy has been changed. It's very clear as a result of what we did. And then very, very fascinatingly, I don't know if you've heard today, the government and parliament announced that they are going to have a citizens' assembly to look at going carbon neutral by 2050. I mean, absolutely incredible. So now we can go at it and say, okay, great that you've made that step, and now make it 2030 or make it adhere to the best science or the precautionary principle, etc. And actually having a talking shop is not enough, and so on and so forth. So huge strides, an absolute transformation in consciousness has occurred. For the first time, I don't know about you, but for the first time in quite a number of years, I, in the last couple of months, have been feeling some hope that we actually do stand some kind of chance of turning things around before everything goes to shit. This civilization is finished, but the possibility that we might be able to transform it into something better has definitely gone up a bit in the last couple of months. And that is so fantastic and so encouraging. And that's really what I mainly want to talk with you about this evening. I'd like us to talk more about the dire nature of the crisis, the various kinds of adaptation as well as mitigation, etc., that we need to do in relation to it. How we have achieved what we've achieved so far, what we need to achieve next. The next phase of the rebellion at full scale, as it were, the resumption of it will probably be sometime in late September. Again, probably centred mainly in London. Again, I'd like to urge you, do whatever you're doing here, really try to prioritise being a part of that. If you can be an arrestable person, absolutely superb. If you can't, then do a support role. That's also superb and absolutely necessary. And we can talk about other consequences already achieved and potentially to be achieved of this kind of stuff that we're trying to do together. One other that we could mention, for example, the fascinating fact that the Green Party had its best ever election results in the local council elections and the European elections in May. I don't think that would have happened without Extinction Rebellion. I think it's obvious that it wouldn't, in fact. And there may be more unexpected effects like that in the future, more things that people were not prepared for, because I can tell you that the Green Party were absolutely not ready to have those superb election results. They didn't expect them at all. So we're into a situation of uncertainty in a good way now, and that's what I'd really love to talk with you about. So thank you for having me here this evening. That's enough of an intro. Thanks, and over to you. Let's have that conversation.
Can I just say that this notion of talking the truth is a really big thing. One of the things that I'm coming across in the research masters that I'm doing in Bristol is there is an extraordinary socially constructed silence about this. And nowhere is it constructed more steel-like than inside universities. And I think that it's particularly brave and courageous to stand out as anybody working inside those institutions, because there's all sorts of reasons why they can't talk about it. It's not because they're nasty people, it's very difficult to break out of those structures and systems. And as an environmental philosopher, I think Rupert's been one of the few who has actually spoken out. And you can probably count them on the fingers of two hands, the academics who are willing to say this is how it is. So I think it's part of our role to make sure that they are able to amplify what they're saying by us engaging with him.
Yeah, I'm interested in the differences really between deep adaptation and transformative adaptation, what you think that might look like. I know it's very difficult to guess because there is so much uncertainty, but I just wondered what your opinion was about that, because I know a lot of people here have read deep adaptation and find it very disturbing and worrying.
So transformative adaptation is a concept that originally comes from the UN, and it's been strongly adopted by Greenhouse, my think tank. It's at the centre of our book, Facing Up to Climate Reality. And what we're trying to say in that book is it's way too late for a mitigation-focused only approach to climate. What we need to do is adapt. But we need to adapt in a way which isn't shallow. And shallow adaptation is, for example, things like simply building higher seawalls and higher flood defences, where what you're trying to do is to carry on with the same old way of life and to defend yourselves against the worsening climate as you go along, as it were. And that's shallow because it's brittle, and it's obviously trying to not engage in any kind of process of seriously questioning the paradigm in which we live. So transformative adaptation says we have to have adaptation. Absolutely, we have to have a lot of it because climate is going to worsen for a long time to come. We need to have adaptation that is simultaneously mitigative. Another of the problems with shallow adaptation is it often actually is bad for mitigation. So you use up a lot of carbon when you build seawalls, etc. Right? We need to have adaptation that is simultaneously mitigative, and we need to have adaptation that works to actually transform our systems so that we tackle the root cause of the problem. And we start to transform into a different society. So an example of transformative adaptation in that context would be something like re-establishing natural wetlands or mangrove swamps, etc., as a flood defense rather than building higher seawalls. Deep adaptation goes a stage further than transformative adaptation. Deep adaptation says it isn't enough to try to transform our society. We have to act as if our society is going to collapse. And we have to make ready for some kind of successor society or some kind of fragments to come after it. And that's what Jem Bendell has famously argued. And Jem is a friend of mine and a colleague. We do have some disagreements about this, though. Jem thinks that collapse is basically inevitable, and therefore that the main focus should be on deep adaptation. I believe that the events of the last few months have actually shown that it's premature to conclude that collapse is inevitable, and that it is at least conceivable that some kind of mass transformation of consciousness may be in process. I still believe it's extremely likely that we will suffer some kind of serious collapse event, possibly irrecoverable, within the next generation. So I strongly believe that we should be deeply adapting. We should be doing things like shutting down nuclear power stations and making safe nuclear waste, because it's an absolute toxic time bomb in a society that has collapsed to have nuclear facilities and cooling pools with fuel rods in them that if you don't continue to attend to them for a very long time to come, will boil dry quickly and then ignite spontaneously and burn for decades or centuries. And I believe that we need to do deep adaptation to make ourselves psychologically ready for a potential collapse, which is a huge, huge task. But I think it's premature to claim that collapse is inevitable. So my approach is a both-and approach. Argue that we need to transformatively adapt and deeply adapt. And I've set this out briefly in a little piece in Medium that you can find, which is called After the IPCC Climate Reality. And there'll be more stuff appearing in due course. So this is a sort of respectful disagreement between Jem Bendel and myself about just how bad the situation is. He thinks it's irrecoverably terrible. I think it's merely really, really terrible, and it's going to be very, very hard to recover it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 children, so I suppose my difficulty, I suppose in one way you think, well, children are quite adaptable themselves anyway, so they'll kind of get used to what happens because they have no other reality, whereas we will come from a very, very different reality. What we were told was gonna happen when we were older. And so I suppose that's a bit I'm struggling with, is how do you talk to them about that? I know you mentioned that in your clip in the video about how you talk to children about that, and it is so uncertain, so it just makes it very hard because you literally have no idea what to say, what animals are going to be left, what the world's going to look like visually, or what jobs are going to be around, or anything that your children you normally talk to about your children about. You know, the conversations that I had with my parents when I was their age, I can't have those conversations with them almost. No. You just have to talk about day-to-day stuff and not future stuff.
Well, yeah, but I think that it all depends on the age of the children. I think before they get to being teenagers, even, you do have to go beyond that, don't you? I mean, because otherwise they start finding out for themselves, and then they're really annoyed with you that you've kept it a secret, right? I mean, one of the things which is really exciting, obviously, is the climate school strikes this year. Here's another mark of how far we've come, right, in just a few months. Probably some of you saw the BBC debate the other night between the Conservative leadership people, contenders, and the last question was from a school climate striker in Scotland, and she was absolutely brilliant. And she said, will you commit to the Extinction Rebellion target of net carbon zero by 2025? Hugely, hugely exciting. Could never have happened even 3 months ago. And the convergence of the climate school strike movement and of Extinction Rebellion, I think, is itself hugely exciting and important. And I think if we're going to really succeed in a big way, and I mean succeed in starting to transform our civilization, starting to end industrial growth society, I think that convergence is the best bet. That's partly how the civil rights movement succeeded in the 60s in America, when the civil rights movement people made the bold and difficult decision to take the risk of actively encouraging the involvement of school children in the civil rights movement. And in particular in Birmingham, Alabama, thousands of children then went to jail. It's a question of, there's some kind of question of balance, isn't there? And some kind of question of children having to grow up, horribly quickly. It's appalling that they're put in that situation. But that is the situation that they're in. There's no way around it. And you've got to try to think, okay, this child is now 7, how far can I go in risking talking to them about what the future's going to be like? This child is 14, it's very different, etc. But yeah, I mean, basically you're right. This is something that would be great to talk about more this evening. This is one of the really difficult things, really difficult aspects of our situation that we're now in.
Nick and I had a conversation about this the other evening because this is something that obviously exercises my mind. And I think it's something about how we as either parents or parent proxies or equivalents model an authentic approach to whatever is happening, because we won't necessarily be able to stop all the bad things that we'd like to from happening to and at our children, which is the page 1 of being a parent. You stop bad shit happening. And this is where I might not be able to do that, which is completely indigestible. So it's about rather than beating them around the head and neck with indigestible information, it's being authentic oneself to that information and maybe modelling the sorts of behaviour that we think might be the best way of figuring out how we walk into it. And there are things there about unity, about communication, about working with other people, about making sure we have the conversation, and maybe about enabling our kids to have the conversation that's really, really difficult, and being truthful and finding real relationships rather than the online ones, which we're all finding out about. But really it's about inculcating, growing, nurturing the skills in them that we think they might need, which we can't know for sure, but our best guess will be probably you're going to need to do how these things, and really those are people skills. It's about how we collaborate and behave as human beings. Yeah. And if we can do that, then we might be able to fix everything for them and sort of clear the path ahead of them to make sure they don't have any bad things. But we might prepare them as best as we possibly can so that they can deal with the bad things as well as possible. And I think that's our role as kids. So sorry to interrupt there, but I think it's a massive, massive issue.
I feel that this has really got to start to get into the consciousness of the majority. I feel a lot of the language used is quite erudite. I struggle with some of the concepts. I'm not a scientist. I've got a humanities background. And I think some of the language is too complex. I wonder how you get some, I know they're complex issues, but how do you get those across in a language that the majority understand?
Yeah.
And not in a university setting, because the majority of people wouldn't come in a room like this. They would feel put off by it. But in a setting out on the street, wherever you can engage the biggest community. So whenever I come to these talks, they're in university settings. And that is quite off-putting. I went to university, but I find it quite off-putting that it's this sort of setting. And I don't know how you engage a wider audience if you keep it to a small echelon and use complex terms.
Yeah. Fair question. Good point. I'll say a couple of things, and I'll be interested in other views because it's a really fundamental one. First point I'd make is I do think that one needs to be sort of audience relative. So if there's any terms that I use this evening that people don't understand, let's clarify them and so on and so forth. But, if I was on TV, I certainly wouldn't use terms like transformative adaptation or deep adaptation. And I think it's really, really important when one is in a mass media type situation, when one's talking to a lot of ordinary people, that one talks in a way which is really comprehensible. I think we've been pretty good at that. In other words, I think that when we've been on TV, on the radio, in the newspapers, etc., most of the time have done a pretty good job, actually, of being pretty accessible. I like to think that I have been. I'm a philosopher. I'm not exactly sort of lowbrow. I like to think that when I'm on the BBC or whatever, that I'm carefully checking my vocabulary and so on and speaking in quite a kind of direct and accessible way. One of the ways that we do that, and this is very, very deliberate, is by being disruptive and being emotionally disruptive, a lot of which means basically just being real and being emotional. So a lot of it isn't actually about, the terms and the concepts that you use or whatever. It's about breaking through all of that to make some kind of direct connection with the viewer. One way which I've done that a bit, for example, and I intend to do more, is the very simple device of turning from say you're the host, turning from you to speak directly into the camera. You can only really get away with doing that when you're live. But I'll be live again for Extinction Rebellion next week on BBC Politics Live on the 26th, and I'm hoping to do it then. And that when you actually look someone like right down the lens of the camera and say something very, very kind of direct and simple, wow, that's really, really powerful. One way in which I think you're absolutely right is that we are not going to win this. We are not going to go to the next level in shifting consciousness and shifting policy. And that's what this ongoing process, and especially the Autumn Rebellion, are going to be about. What we want to have by the end of the Autumn Rebellion is, for example, a citizens' assembly with real legislative power and force, right? Not just the wonderful talking shop that they promised today. We're not going to succeed in that unless we use language about some of this in ways which are much more direct in the ways that they link up with people's lives. And I think that's what you're asking for. So, for example, there's a limit on the usefulness of the discourse of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, right? What actually matters to people is things like whether they're going to have enough to eat, right? And that is very much part of what we're talking about, right? So part of the way I believe that we're going to succeed, and here I'm very much on the same page as Jim and the people around really close to him. Part of the way that I think we're going to succeed, if we do succeed, is by getting people to understand this is not about something remote. This is not about something to do with kind of highly kind of scientific concepts, etc. This is about, if we do not fix the climate, if we do not stop devastating it, if we do not stop devastating wildlife and nature, then we are not going to have food to put on the table quite soon. And you got a taste of that, as it were, last summer, right? In the baking hot summer that we had here, which it stopped being baking hot in July. And imagine if that heat wave had gone on into August, September, October. You were already getting quite a lot of crops in this country shrinking a lot. For example, where I live in East Anglia, the onion harvest went down almost by half. What we're talking about is with the climate disasters, with the disrupted weather we're getting, etc., we are at risk of crashing our civilization for a number of reasons, and one of the main reasons is we are at risk of people not having enough to eat. Right? And when people don't have enough to eat, well, either they die, or at the very best, you get things like mass migrations, which will make the migrations we've had so far look like absolutely nothing. Probably, violence breaking out over food supply. The mind boggles, but you know some of this stuff from times when it's occurred in history. So, where I think you're absolutely right is if we're going to succeed in the mass consciousness shift that we need going an order of magnitude further, which is what needs to happen next, we need to find ways of talking very effectively and communicating very effectively and simply about things which are very, very accessible and real to people. For example, is there going to be food on the table or not?
Can I ask a question specifically on the issue of food security? Because I agree that it's one of the easiest or most obvious ways of engaging people. So Jem Bendell talks about how, 8 of the last years have been the hottest on record, or whatever it is, and saying that, as you say, vegetable production was down 35%, and there's only 4 months' worth of food reserves in the global system. Has anybody tried to put a figure on the likelihood of food shortages in the Northern Hemisphere? Because when I've been trying to engage people, I've been saying those facts, but I haven't had something to hand that I can just say the probability is around about X% of running out of food in London in the next 5 years.
Firstly, the simple answer is no. No one's really done that. There are people around Extinction Rebellion who are now trying to do it, and people around, again, Jem and his team who are now trying to do it. There's some reason to believe, as far as I can tell, that people in the FAO and other organizations that should be doing this kind of thing have been kind of avoiding doing it as something which is sort of something which is, well, too disruptive to even consider, or something which people at the top of their organizations are not willing to stomach yet. It's the Food and Agricultural Organization? Yeah. I think we're getting to the point now where there are going to be whistleblowers from such organizations, or such organizations are going to shift their agendas, and you will get some of this. But then can I say something slightly different, which is that I think you shouldn't hope for too much from these kinds of figures for a few reasons. One reason is that, unfortunately, absolutely, more than unfortunately, absolutely tragically and appallingly, we are spinning our climate potentially out of control. Each year is a new situation. The last 4 years have been like nothing in the weather and climate history of the Earth hitherto, really. So there is a strict limit on on what we know, and there's a strict limit, therefore, on how much sense it can make to invoke percentages. It's like these figures that they're using for flood risk. You know, they say a 1 in 100-year flood or something, but we all know that actually it's now something more like 1 in 50 year or 1 in 20 years. But we can't make that much more precise. We don't know whether it's 1 in 50 or 1 in 20 or 1 in 10, and it's actually worse than that in terms of the food situation, because it's so much more complex. The most important thing here is the precautionary principle, which I've written a lot about, and if anyone doesn't know about the precautionary principle, it's worth looking into. The very basic idea of the precautionary principle is, if something potentially terrible is coming along, then you don't need evidence that it's definitely going to come along before you move to act to try to stop it, right? So what the precautionary principle says in this case is, look, we don't really know whether there's a 5% chance of some kind of famine in this country within the next 5 years, or a 25% chance or something, but do we really need to know? I mean, do we actually need to compute what that chance is? I mean, even a 1% chance is far too much, right? Would you get on a plane if it had a 1% chance of crashing? And some people, when they hear that, they think superficially, yeah, that sounds all right. But actually, no, that's really, really crazy thing to do. You know, planes are not allowed to fly unless their chance of crashing is something like 0.0001 or something percent. What you want to do if you're facing some kind of disastrous outcome is do pretty much everything and anything that you can without creating other potentially disastrous outcomes to stop it from happening. So what I basically say is, look, there is some possibility. We can't compute it, probably, although we should do more work to try to get somewhere near a rough estimate of it. There is some probability now that there are going to be famines not in those, third world countries where people expect them. Appallingly, we allow things like what's happening in Yemen to happen already, but happening here as well. So, we're starting to get to a situation where to some extent we actually are all in this together. And it's only common sense to use precaution against that, and to say the only ethical thing to do, the only intelligent thing to do, is to have an absolute wartime mobilization equivalent to stop these kinds of risks in as much as we possibly can.
Some years ago, I was involved with an ex-university thing called Energy Security in a Multipolar World, and one of the women working on that worked in the Civil Defence College, and she was looking at the contingency planning of supermarkets and about food supply, and she was brilliant. But she said, well, actually, we're 9 meals away from devastation in this country if there's any disruption to food supply. But I think from what she was saying about the things they were doing then, which was 5 years ago, that because climate change is on the risk register of the government, there will be people hiding away in the MOD or the Civil Defence College who are aware of all these issues. Whether their message is getting out is another matter, but I think there are people that are scaring themselves silly working on this. Yeah. We just need to get to them and get them opening more.
Yeah, there are. There aren't enough, and they aren't being taken seriously enough. Also, we need to be a tiny bit careful what we wish for, of course. There are good people in the Ministry of Defence, but perhaps not quite as many as one would wish there to be. One wants to be very careful that these kind of issues don't get, as the term goes, securitized, that they don't get turned into issues of sort of defending ourselves at all costs in a sort of shallow adaptation way, and quite a sort of aggressive, potentially, military, etc. Type way. So the more that we can mainstream this into universities, as was being said before, universities ought to be doing a lot more about the long emergency that we are now in. There's still far too much of what universities do about this kind of stuff is still to do with paradigms of sustainable development and risk management and so on and so forth. But these are really yesterday's paradigms. Universities are among the institutions which need to be asking questions like just how desperate is the situation, just how exposed are we to large-scale famines across continents or in developed countries. What kinds of transformative and deep adaptations should we be engaging in soon or now in order to forestall these risks, etc. Yeah. But there are people, the good news is there are a growing number of civil servants, for example, who are starting to kind of get a little bit ready to put their head above the parapet and ask some of these difficult questions.
I just wondered, in framing it as, if you like, or from Rupert and other people, if you were to say on the, we XR have to find the right language to reach out to this body of ordinary people. I sort of want to push back against that. I feel like that way of talking, one of the things that blew my mind as a spectator of that week from down here, I was back down here by Monday morning, was the demographic. And it wasn't just about like middle class versus working class. It was Phil Kingston and the Christian climate activists in their 80s and 12-year-olds. I did the last leg of the walk through London, and I was with an 80-year-old woman on one side and a 10-year-old girl on the other. And I think it's about who speaks, not what they're saying. And I think that's already happening, and that's what's incredible about this is you meet people over and over again who say, my God, we were talking about this 30 years ago, and it was just us, the usual suspects. And I presume if Extinction Rebellion can do anything useful, it's recognise the value of who's speaking and give them a chance to speak. And it's like Greta Thunberg's proved that to all of us. It's not, she speaks brilliantly with this amazing lucidity, so of course what she says is essential, but it's who's speaking as well. We had a talk in Falmouth. Kai came, she set up a screening in her home, invited the neighbours. Her brother came, he kind of, shall we say, got radicalised. He went back to Lostwithiel, and then last week, the Lostwithiel meeting had 100 people, and I'm sure they were not all kind of middle-aged white male academics, so I feel like there's something more than just the kind of elites sort of using the right language to speak to all the simple, ordinary folk.
Before you got radicalised, you thought I was mad. Thank you very much.
One very brief question, if that's okay, to do with food. You're talking about us running out of supplies of food. I just wonder, we waste so much food though. I mean, over the course of a week, supermarkets probably fill up a whole skip with sacks of bread. I was just wondering if we could possibly offset the risks of famine and things by making better use of the food we've got, maybe preserving some of it somehow. I'm not quite sure how you preserve bread, for example, but could we possibly get out of trouble by, making more efficient use of the food we do grow and we do produce, and actually using all of it as opposed to throwing, like, I don't know what it is, a third of it or something away?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, of course. Simon Fairley is one of the top experts on this. Again, this is a topic which hasn't been researched nearly as much as it should be. His conclusion is that if we almost eliminate food waste, and if our diets become a lot more vegan than they are, i.e. we basically stop growing food for animals and only rear animals in places where it's appropriate to do so, where you can't grow crops, and if we become, much more efficient in a number of other related processes, then in this country we can just about feed ourselves at the moment. Because remember that at the moment we import about 40% of our food. That's net in this country. Now, of course, the problem is that what we're talking about is a climate chaotic future that we're moving into, where we may not be able to rely on that level of food production, and we may not be able to rely on food imports if you get a generalized, say, drought across the Northern Hemisphere or something. So, of course you're right, and those kinds of things should be absolute priorities. We should be having a massive national drive, local drives, etc., to eliminate food waste. But even if we do that successfully, we still potentially face possibly civilizational meltdown type levels of food shortages within the next generation. So that's one good reason why I think it's right to say that one can't avoid taking seriously the deep adaptation agenda as well as the transformative adaptation agenda, because we cannot guarantee that even if we make brilliant transformative changes within the next 5 to 10 years in countries like this one, we cannot guarantee that they're going to be enough.
I was going to just observe that in terms of the biodiversity collapse in the Northern Hemisphere, that is mostly the result of farming. And we've all been very happy beneficiaries of that up until now, but here we stand. However, you said something just now which made me think, and I... Oh, sorry, I am a farmer, yeah. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, I just want to describe my experience. I used to grow some crops here, but given our climate in Cornwall and given the quality of soils we have, we could grow crops to feed to animals. And then I did a carbon audit and I found even on our little organic farm, we were chucking out 300 plus tons a year carbon through doing that. But actually it was really easy to stop. And that was by growing grass only and feeding our animals which are designed to eat grass and not eat starch or pulses. And as a consequence, we now sequester something like 350 tons of carbon a year net. Okay, that's after all our electricity, all the methane they burp out, all the diesel, etc. So if you really want to be vegan, you're going to have to find where you can find a loaf of bread which is carbon negative. You can't. You're going to have to find a potato which is carbon negative. You can't. If you just want to live off something that grows off trees or learn to graze, you'll be fine. Otherwise, if we want to grow food in this country, we have to have properly integrated agroecology, regenerative farming, and that depends. It doesn't have animals as an add-in, it depends on animals, but it's got to be done right. And we have a farm. I was at Cirencester yesterday at the Agricultural University, and they are living deep, deep in the 20th century, just with lots of tech additions and so on. We've got to change the bloody system, or we really are royally screwed. Never mind the fucking weather, you know. Anyway, thanks.
I think you're absolutely right about the fundamental need to shift to an agroecological approach. And you may have heard in what I said that I didn't say that I think we need to become totally vegan. I think that's actually not plausible, partly for the reasons that you mentioned. But what Simon Fairley, who I think would agree with what you've just said, does argue is that we need to eat a lot less animal flesh in this country, and in particular we need to stop doing the thing which you said we need to stop doing, namely growing these crops which could be eaten by human beings and feeding them to animals instead. We could have a debate about just how far one can go towards an agroecological system with reducing animal inputs, but I don't think there's a fundamental disagreement between you and I.
In a context where we've had these massive floods in the US Midwest, and then again more lately in China, and the talk about multi-breadbasket failure, and the level of fear that puts in those of us who know a bit about this is quite high. And in terms of how that impacts on us as a society, as activists, as scientists, as people involved in this, when you've got this knowledge, that means you look at the news in certain ways. And I'm wondering how that slots in with the deep adaptation, because it's not necessarily great to be building a movement and responding to this, transforming climatic system where the jet stream is no longer circling and is getting stuck from a place of fear. And so managing our own sort of traumatized responses to this and the way we handle each other and the situation we face, I suppose, is my question, which doesn't necessarily need an immediate response, but in terms of looking at the land use and the consequences of that land use for flooding and the feedback there of flooding to farming, etc. It's just a bit of a tangle.
I'll just say two things very quickly. One is, the first thing is, as Manda said earlier, something I've been arguing for the last few years is that we have to talk about all of this. So one important point would be, if you're somebody who's kind of feeling kind of scared by some of this conversation, don't go home and sort of sit by yourself at the end of tonight. Talk with other people in the room or other people that you know, or through virtual networks or whatever it is. We have to talk about all this. We have to keep on talking about it. And of course, there are ways of talking about it which are deliberately kind of, therapeutic. Like eco-psychology, for example, is an approach which is very good about this. What eco-psychology basically says is, if you're feeling afraid, if you're in grief, etc., over what's happening, that's not a problem with you that needs to be fixed. That's a problem with the world that needs to be fixed. And your response, your emotional response, is actually a rational response. And the other thing that I wanted to say, therefore, was that I think that we should be proud of and willing to embrace these emotions, including fear. Right? What you don't want is to get controlled by fear and thrown into a kind of pure panic response. But remember what Greta Thunberg said. She said, I want you to act like your house is on fire, because it is. I want you to panic for a while. I want you to have a kind of reaction of, Christ, we've got to do something, because we do. And of course, that's another thing about battling fear. One of the best ways of battling fear and doing something about it is to do something. And I think that what a lot of us have found is that the no-holds-barred, honest approach of Extinction Rebellion is itself really empowering, and itself helps to kind of manage some of these emotions when they become too difficult. But as I say, I would be it's a terribly, terribly important question.
Just as a farmer, if I could just respond just briefly, because it seems to me that it'd be lovely to have the whole evening talking about land use, because there's so many different aspects to it. It seems to me a real imperative for us is to recarbonise our soils. Has to be right up there at the top of what we need to do. In order to do that, we've got to deal with the pesticides issue. I don't think we're giving it enough attention. I think it needs to be at the top of the agenda, because if we dramatically reduce our use of pesticides, which we have to do for ecological reasons, we will reduce our food production. We already import 40% of our food. How are we going to deal with that? We've got to deal with it. We don't have any choice. We've got to deal with it. So I just leave that hanging there, because actually my question was completely different.
And you've kind of thrown a little bomb in there, but maybe I can diffuse it slightly. Isn't it somewhat contingent? You say if we reduce our pesticide use, we're going to reduce our food production. But if we massively increase the amount of labour that we use on the land, isn't there some reason to believe that that could compensate for it?
Yeah, indeed. And if we can transfer between different crops.
Yeah.
So there are possibilities there. But it was just like an opening salvo.
Yes,
so,
I gathered that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to ask my question.
Yeah.
So my question was to express a fear, and this is about telling the truth. So I'm going to tell the truth. So we've got fantastic people here who are doing amazing work across Cornwall. So I want to talk about Cornwall. A lot of the work has been with parish and town councils, looking at introducing action plans at a local level, declaring an emergency at a parish level, and looking at what can be done. And there are a group of us, several of whom are here, who are also working with Cornwall Council, who declared the emergency in January, and are just completing their action plan now. And what we're doing is encouraging people to the best of our ability. This is my interpretation of it. We're encouraging people to the best of our ability to do practical things to improve conditions for the planet within their locality. So we might be talking about issues around housing. At Cornwall level, we're talking about retrofitting houses, we're talking about passive housing, we're talking about reducing transport. I'm got a big thing about aviation, flying, so it's like reducing flying. All these measures. My fear is the rebound effect, that we save energy or whatever, let's say we save energy, and as a result of that energy being saved, householders or local residents, whoever they are, find extra cash in their pockets, which they then spend on other items which are carbon-intensive items. So we're actually not gaining anything. Or else because technology, we're making things more efficiently, then we get the rebound effect of more uses coming in for that particular technology. So we're not saving anything anyway. And at the same time, what we have to have is a cultural, behavioural, social, community transformation. And it's like, are we doing the right thing? Is this the right way to go about it? And how do we get from the kind of technical, practical, physical, easily handleable change into what we all know we've got to do, which is you called it a paradigm shift, but it's a complete cultural transformation. Sorry, long question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another round of applause. Well, two thoughts to start out on that. On the end part of what you said there, we must never allow ourselves to think something like, if we get every county council in the country to have some really great plan, then that's job done or something. This is so much bigger than that. And if we're gonna make it through this, there's gonna have to be a real cultural, philosophical, ethical, spiritual, I would claim, transformation. One of the things that I'm going to be working on more in the next year, some of you may already have seen a bit of it in some of my talks or something, but is the way in which I see the challenge that we are facing as, among other things, a spiritual challenge. Now that word puts some people off, although I think maybe it puts a few less people off than it used to. Basically, the point is, unless we have a new conception of what fundamentally matters and of what we are and of what our relationship is to the earth, or if even the word relationship is wrong, if in some sense the whole thing is more integrated than that, unless we have something like that, then in the end, the technical, etc. changes we make are not going to be enough. So, and I think a lot of people, well, I know that a lot of people in Extinction Rebellion feel that way, and there's quite a lot of people in Extinction Rebellion doing work explicitly on that. So I think ultimately the challenge is not just a technical one or a political one, it's a spiritual one. Coming back to the first part of your question, that really is a vital observation. It's a slightly technical point from green economics or ecological economics, but it's very, very simple to understand. Oliver put it pretty clearly, I think. If you, for example, put in insulation in people's roofs and make them a bit better off as a result, and you don't do anything else, then there's a serious risk that they'll just go on an extra holiday to Torremolinos or whatever, right? That's the rebound effect. And it's very, very hard to deal with unless you have a systematic approach to these things. This is one reason why purely bottom-up solutions, while absolutely vital and a part of a cultural shift and so on, are very unlikely to be enough to the crisis that we face. There has to be a societal level and ultimately a global level work on this. There has to be work at the political level as well as at the spiritual level. If we don't do this collectively, then we don't do it at all. And that's one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion says we have to revolutionize the existing structures of power, but we also have to some extent, use them, and we have to have a real democracy. We need a citizens' assembly which is going to decide together, and we need to have these locally as well, of course, going to decide together how we do this stuff. And we have to choose to constrain ourselves in some senses, in some respects, together. One of the things that this translates into is that we need something like hard resource caps or something like rationing. And without one or the other or both of those, again, there's no way that we're going to do enough. Even if half of us do enough, if the other half carry on doing what they're doing, or even do more because there's more oil or whatever it is left to go round, then again, we're still stuffed. So this is part of why the challenge is so huge and so multi-dimensional, and part of why one has to have a profound level of seriousness in how one approaches it and not think that that it's even conceivable that some purely technological changes, for example, could be enough. If we get certain kinds of efficiencies, but we don't change our political structures and our consciousness, then we're still going to be stuffed. Yeah.
Oliver, I think that what you're doing and what lots of us are doing at the small scale, do you know, is really, really important, because it actually all gives us hope. And you might just think in your community, you decide to drill some holes in a tree trunk and make some insect hotels. But do you know, it's snowballing in our little parish where we have real, people who find the word climate change just a huge exaggeration. However, your point, exactly, it's my first and second time coming to something to do with Extinction Rebellion, and I grapple with the scale issue, the exact point you're saying, because all the ideas are there. I know Kate Rayworth came to talk to you about the difference in economic approach and the donut and all that. Ha-Jun Chang at Cambridge University has been talking alternative economics for years, as many of you know. So sort of the academic side's there. So even if we engage with universities, the thought is there. It's been there for years. So I worry, and I look back over my life, I'm 67, and I see amazing points in history that I've lived through that I never thought would happen. I cried when the Berlin Wall came down, and I keep thinking about that. How did that transformation happen? How did Nelson Mandela spend 27 years in prison and then come out and destroy apartheid? And you've touched on it, Soweto involved children. So, it's all generations that count. But also, how do we engage with the international community? I'm sorry, I've got so many questions. But at the international community, we did get some things right. If you think of, I remember teaching youngsters about the ozone depletion and plotting the Dobson units to show the increasing gap on the Antarctic. I come from a slight science background. And we got that right. Montreal Protocol, organisation at the international level, and we sorted it. Now I look at Bolsonaro, Trump, and I look at the destruction, even us leaving EU, but I don't want to get onto that. But, the breakdown of international organisations, when these are international, global, whole system programmes. So I'm completely puzzled. I love Extinction Rebellion. I think we brought it to everybody's attention. But now, how do we put the pressure points on international organisations? How do we bring those great ideas of Rayworth, Ha-Jun Chang into government? How do we make... Listening to that debate the other night, how much... did you hear about the environment? Absolutely nothing. A tiny amount.
3 months ago, there would have probably been literally nothing.
True, but the other thing, I've sat here, and on the emotional thing, then I will be quiet, I can't take all the doom and gloom, because, at 67, I've lived through some pretty grim times at odd time in my life, like most of us do. And, I had to have real hope that I could get out of it. And once that really, really matters. So my thoughts so far, and I've thought about it for years and years and years, but brief contact with you, great stuff. But how do you move on to the next stage in that citizen assembly and say, right, we've got hydrogen trains. Why are we doing HS2? I don't know much about hydrogen trains. I just heard it on the news today. Why are we not stalling that for a minute and making sure the whole of the network change to carbon neutral hydrogen methods? So we need more solutions, we need hope, we need the sheer joy of being a human being, and think back to all those human beings in history that have done it. It can be done. So let's have more hope, please, is my thought.
I recognise all the things that you said, and I agree, and it's a very big thing, and I know we're talking about how we feel about it, but I would like to pick your brains. One of the things that we're trying to do as a group in St Neots is get local initiatives going. One of the things on our agenda now is to go and meet with the young farmers. We can't go to the young farmers and say, we need to get rid of pesticides. We cannot dictate, we can't be negative, we've got to be positive. We want to go to them and say, how do you view the future? How do you view 2050? What's it going to be like? What are you going to be doing? How are you going to be working? And hope that they give us some responses. Now, we might get a stony silence. What would you do in that situation? How would you try and get them moving? Because at the moment they're as the gentleman said, they're back in the 20th century.
I just wanted to ask the room's opinion about some things that have been raised by Oliver and other people, that maybe a transition movement approach is still relevant within an XR heading, and the local groups are very much about connecting with communities and striking a balance between rebellion and cooperation with people in their communities, such as parish councils, and whether they saw any conflict in that, and what the whole XR agenda might be in encouraging people to go to London to protest and rebel, but also to creating connections and small, softer changes in the community, maybe about insects hotels, engaging with schools and raising awareness.
Great. So let me have a go at that. Hope, look, I totally agree. And hope is in the title of the Facing Up to Climate Reality book. But look, I think we have to ask a couple of questions. One is hope for what? And one of the things that I've been arguing, and that a number of us have been arguing for the last few years, and it seems like the time for that has kind of come this year, is that a lot of what we've been told that we should hope for is no longer realistic to hope for. So the basic point that I make is it is no longer realistic to hope that something like the society as we know it is going to continue for much longer. It just is not possible. Right? We either change it radically or it will collapse. In other words, we either proactively create radical change or radical change gets forced upon us. And in terms of some of the things that translates into meaning, you know, we could have some interesting conversations, but I'm pretty skeptical about hydrogen trains. I think that probably isn't the kind of thing which should be top of our agenda, that we should be aiming at, because I think that's probably basically another throw within the same sort of technocentric, technocratic paradigm, which is very, very unlikely to bring us the kind of absolutely drastic and transformational change, including absolutely drastic, rapid carbon reductions that we need in the timescale that we need for it. You asked how is Extinction Rebellion going to work in a world with Bolsonaro and Trump and so on and so forth, and of course, you know, wow, yeah, it's pretty grim, and that's again why our prospects are grim. But the suggested model is something like this, that we are trying to model in this country how it can work. And believe you me, the world is watching Britain now. You know, people in climate movement and ecological movements and so on around the world are watching Britain now in a way that has not been the case before. Of course, you know, there's been inspirational stuff going on all over the world for a long time. Indigenous peoples have been showing inspirational leadership on this for a long time. People have been fighting against the deforestation of the Amazon brilliantly, and a million things we could talk about. Right now, some real attention is shifting to us. And if we can actually show that this works even better than we already have, then it could be copied all over the world. I know climate activists right now in America who are trying to copy what we've done so far, and are looking forward to what we can potentially achieve this autumn so we can carry on copying it. So the basic model is this. If we manage to bring off this rebellion in this country, if we manage to take it an order of magnitude further forward in the autumn and then maybe another iteration next spring or something, I don't know, then the idea is that it goes international in that way. And that is why one of the things that Extinction Rebellion in this country is trying to do really hard is to pump prime growth in Extinction Rebellion around the world, and a lot of resources are going into that, including money. How should we speak to farmers? Gosh, big, difficult question. I may not be the best person to answer it. I'll just say a couple of quick things. I think we should appeal to farmers in the same way we appeal to everybody, by talking about long-termism and by talking about do you want a decent future for your kids, and look at the science and be precautionary and so on. But we should also do it in ways that are specific. So, for example, farmers care about the soil, or at least, you know, intelligent farmers care about the soil. We should hammer home stuff to do with the fact that soil is not a non-renewable resource, right? I mean, soil has to be renewable, else we're all dead. And you know, Michael Gove even says we've got like 50 harvests left using the soil the way we're using it. Ultimately, the Extinction Rebellion point on how to speak to farmers would be we're going to have a citizens' assembly which is going to decide all of these things with everybody speaking and everybody inputting to it and so on. And in terms of the really important question about conflict and cooperation, I guess my answer to that would be a sort of pragmatic one, which is there's lots of things to be done. You know, I hope that pretty much everybody in this room is going to at least seriously consider going to London for a few days or a week or a month this autumn. But there's also tons of stuff you can do for Extinction Rebellion here in Cornwall. And it's really crucial also to have people continuing to be active in things like the transition movement and, you know, just doing stuff locally, like doing stuff for their local pollinators and insects and so on and so forth. You know, my message is not the Autumn Rebellion in London matters and nothing else does. Everything matters. It's just that some things are particularly crucial because they share particular potentiality for transforming consciousness and then transforming practice. And we've seen that now, right? We've seen it happen this April. So we need to learn that lesson and absorb that lesson and apply that going forward.
I just want to say this thing about how to speak to farmers. I think a really effective thing is go there and try and buy something off them. Try and start a dialogue over what they do and what you like. I think farmers, sadly, are getting really pissed off at being lectured at by everyone. You know, farming is a strange thing. It's very inward-looking kind of business, I think, for a whole host of reasons. And it badly needs some good news stories, but you can't even just say you need a good news story, start treating your farm differently. It's more fundamental. We've got to be treating like human beings and try and get some basic dialogue going over buying, I don't know, a pint of milk or something, or a pound of bacon.
When I was in London, I took the opportunity to talk to as many people as I could on the bridge, all the people walking past. And I lost my voice by the end of 2 days. I think I probably spoke to about 90 people, had 2 negative reactions, 2 people bursting into tears. They couldn't even speak because they were so emotional. And lots of people wanted the opportunity to talk about it. So suddenly they were able to talk about it because, as we all know, the Overton window moved. And that is the most important thing everyone can do, is just talk to everybody, find out what they do, ask them how they feel about what they do, how do they feel that looks like in the future, and then use that as your opening gambit.
I come from Finland, and until perhaps 3 months ago, the government was like really conservative, and they were like behind the 2050 carbon neutral thing. And now we got a new, really young government, and they just decided, no, 2050 is not enough. It's going to be 2025. And I was like, yes! So it's happening.
The thing about children is key. Somebody's been doing some really useful videos about the important thing when you're talking to children about this future is to help them feel safe, and that you will be there and looking after them, and you will be going through that with them and not labeling it all on their head. It's not for them to deal with, which is what I grew up with, and it's not great. So yeah, just to hold them and help them through that and be with them through it. And about talking to people during the rebellion in London, that was epic. I made a point of chatting to people who had very long commute in and out to the bridge, and every ethnic minority person I spoke to was totally supportive. I would say about half the white people. So there's been a very interesting spin saying, oh, XR is all white and middle class. Now it's much safer for white middle class people to do something like the rebellion, and it's a privilege to not face really repressive policing, which people do face in many other parts of the world, and they've been facing even in France the past couple of days. Some people from XR have gone to Cannes and had some quite rough times. So anyway, just to say, it's quite complex, all that, and it's beautiful talking to people about it, because what opens when you just have taken that step, the Overton window, you can see it opening to the trees. It's beautiful.
Absolutely right.
I didn't quite understand that, lady. Like what you said about speaking to the children.
Just to be very careful about these matters when dealing with small children, and to help them feel safe.
I think we should just be
very honest with them and say that if we're doing harm to them, that we should stop it. And we should stop right now, and we should, all of us in this room, I think we should be living as lower carbon lives as we can. And that will be the answer, because if we all think that we can just carry on earning loads of money and spending it in a different way, maybe not flying, but I think we should be really, really cutting right back, and then everything will be fine. If we cut right back.
Thank you.
The 2025 target makes clear we need an emergency response. We have to be precautious. We've been thoroughly reckless. And an emergency response which is going to work within that kind of timescale is going to involve some really drastic changes. It's not going to mean, for example, that we all just carry on driving cars only that are all electric. If we're actually serious about 2025, lots of cars will simply have to be phased out, right? And lots of industries will simply have to be phased out. And that's being honest. And I think when we're talking to kids, as we were saying earlier, there's a balance to be struck. On the one hand, yeah, it's irresponsible to just kind of do a sort of dump of everything onto kids and make them feel terrified without any context. But I think it's also wrong to give kids a false sense of security. And I think one of the things we need to find a way of honestly doing with kids, especially as they get to be 10 years old, 12 years old, whatever. Remember, the age of criminal responsibility in this country is 10. I mean, it's crazy, but it is. And it seems to me that if you're old enough to go to jail, then you're old enough for there to be a way found of telling you the truth about the society you live in. I think we need to say to kids, look, unless we really drastically change, then your future could be pretty grim. And I've given school talks when I've said that kind of thing to kids, and certainly to my university students. And most of them seem to appreciate it. They say things like, it's great to have adults not just pretending that we can't talk about any of this and can't deal with any of it. It's great to feel as if someone's actually talking honestly with us.
I don't want to put words in Zoe's mouth. I think it's about trying to hold the
balance
space
to be struck,
with our kids while we do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So rather than saying, it's just shit and I'm leaving now, that's not how you do it, by the way. If anybody thought that was a good way, it's really not a good way of doing it.
The time frame is now to act. That's quite clear. The only quick question I had was why are we waiting until autumn to take the next action and then maybe spring again? Why? What's the logic on that? Why not say next month?
The answer to that is mainly a kind of pragmatic one. People are exhausted, they're knackered. They need to regenerate. And one of the things which is great about XR is it has this regenerative culture built into it. The idea is that we try to avoid burnout, which has blighted so many previous movements. So the idea is it's actually realistic to aim for doing something huge again in the autumn, because we want it to be even bigger, a lot bigger, and a lot longer. And that requires some real preparation. It requires people to be rested and ready for it. It doesn't mean don't do anything in the meantime, right? It just means don't go to London and stand in the middle of Waterloo Bridge, right? You can. There's a million things, obviously, you can do in the meantime, like do brilliant stuff here. So that's basically the answer to that. Also, there's some interesting stuff going on with kind of timing, which is why we can't give you an exact date yet. It's being debated in terms of what I was talking about earlier, segueing in with the school climate strikers and thinking about things like the start of term and the involvement of students and that kind of thing. Yeah.
And there's the general strike.
Yeah. That's right. This is really crucial. If people haven't heard about this yet, then this is why this time is the right time, roughly. From the 20th to the 27th of September, the school climate strikers have called very audaciously for a general strike, and that's a crucial thing to be looking to prepare for.
We demand citizens' assemblies, but I don't think we're quite clear what they are or how many people they involve. I'd be happy with one or 2,000 to see if that would work. The Irish model seems to be good, but maybe that was just Irish. Are we working on what we mean by citizens' assemblies?
Hi, Rupert.
I'd like to know what you think the government actually knows, because my MP will not engage with me. I've written to her 10 times on climate change, and she will not engage with me at all on that subject, although she will on other things. Something is up. I don't understand.
So there will be a last generation on Earth. Right? Either in a few billion years' time the sun will expand and swallow the Earth, or we'll do something to instigate our own demise before then, as is obviously the subject we're here for now. So there will be a last child born, and there will be a last empty skyscraper to fall onto the buildings below. But if you look at the film The Titanic, there are 4 musicians that decide not to get on a lifeboat, and they just play music to try to calm the mood, knowing that most people are not going to make it onto lifeboats. So I'm wondering whether, from a kind of psychological or philosophical perspective, what do you think makes us feel like that generation shouldn't be us? And is there somehow a way of twisting the mentality of that to somehow spin a position of honour or pride or responsibility that we might be that last generation and we might be the ones that need to batten down the hatches? Is there some way of making that in some way positive, like the Titanic musicians?
Wow.
I'll try and make this a short sentence. I feel like I keep coming back to the same point again and again when I talk to people who are in the centre of Extinction Rebellion and hear something quite different from them individually than the muscular rhetoric. And it seems similar, as in his XR itself talks about the history of the Green movement and a kind of self-censorship around we must give a positive message. I think it relates to your interesting and different presentation of the notion of deep adaptation to Jem Bendel's, which seems to me a different interpretation of climate science. You know, either food is going to run out in a few years or it's not, and it's a kind of interpretation of the science. And it's about children. And to me, I think my hope for XR is that it barely knows what it is yet. It's this huge thing has happened in 8 months. You know, what was it, 15 people in Stroud has turned into this. And I wonder if the word we need to shed is unless, you know, that we say to the kids, it's going to be this bad unless. I think most people I know who are critical of XR don't believe that there's no problem, they believe there's no unless. And so we need to change it to therefore. So, you know, we are facing a situation of worsening climate change that we will not stop. We don't know exactly what that means and when. Therefore, we're doing this. And it's a radical restructuring of the way we live now.
Citizens' assemblies. So there's a national XR Citizens' Assemblies working group, and by the way, you know, if anyone has kind of serious expertise and time or whatever and wants to get involved in any of these working groups, that's always potentially possible. And yeah, they're working on these questions. In terms of the numbers, yeah, it could be 1,000. That's what they did in Iceland. The Ireland model is the most successful model of citizens' assemblies in recent years in terms of what's extant. So I think the Ireland model should be seriously looked at. One of the interesting things about the Ireland model was that in the first one, the Constitutional Convention, they had politicians included in it. And many people thought that would make it impossible for it to work because they thought that the politicians would just dominate it. But that's not what happened in actual fact. The politicians ended up quite a lot of them being quite sort of humbled by the involvement of the ordinary people. And it got the politicians' buy-in. It's one way to get politicians' buy-in. Another way of getting politicians' buy-in, though, is to just, and I think politicians are starting to wake up to this now, is to get them to understand, and I think Macron, for example, has woken up to this, is to get them to understand that a citizens' assembly can be a brilliant sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for them, and a way of getting something out of the so-called too difficult box, where politicians stick things which they think are unpopular and so on and so forth. Because the politicians can potentially say, well, look, it's not me that's saying this, it's you that's saying this. The Citizens' Assembly is saying they demand this radical action. And that, I think, is one of the real kind of clevernesses of the third XR demand around citizens' assemblies. How to deal with rubbish MPs. So let me counterpose that with how to deal with good MPs. So I think with good MPs, we should say it's really, really good what you're saying and what you're doing and how you're voting, if they're voting well and so on. You need to go further in this way and that way. With rubbish MPs, I think what we should do is we should say, you should be like these good MPs. And if you're not, you're going to suffer for it. And the suffering can take various forms. It can obviously take the form of being voted out, but it can take other forms as well. You could do direct action against your rubbish MP, right? And you could make very, very clear that good MPs are not going to suffer these kinds of direct actions. And this direct action, there's all sorts of forms it could take. One very simple form it could take is getting someone in a chicken suit running around, behind them for a long period of time until they agree to answer your questions, right? And that has been known to work. Okay, then on to the final two questions, which are these really huge questions. So first, we might be the last generation. So look, I totally agree that it's better to play music as the ship goes down than to just, fight each other or something like that. But I've argued that it is premature to conclude that we are the last generation. Grossly premature, I think, actually. And there are people out there who are much more extreme than Jem Bendel. There's this woman, Catherine somebody, saying that we're bound to go extinct, for example. Some of you have probably read her stuff. I just think it's rubbish. I mean, there's no scientific basis for that. The argument between Jem and I is partly to do with how you read the science. Basically, my point is I think we are not in a position where we can say it is certain that society is going to collapse. But I fundamentally agree with what you tried to put there, Matt. I think that it is true that XR is still doing some self-censorship. I think there is too much talk of we've got 12 years left to save the Earth. I think we should talk more about adaptation, and there is quite a lot of discourse within XR about the need to talk more about adaptation. I think we should talk more about the fact that in climatic terms, things are bound to get worse for a long time, whatever we do. That is fact, because of the time lags built into the system. And you're right, when people in XR gather together nationally and bare their hearts, what most of them think is that collapse is very, very likely, and that it is certain that things are going to get worse for a long time. So we should find ways of sharing that message more, and we are still not telling the truth enough ourselves. Why do I think that we should not rest easy with the thought that we might be the last generation? Well, the answer basically is because life is wonderful, right? Life is absolutely fantastic, and one of the things which is thrilling about being involved with this movement is that I think we get to feel that a bit more than we do if we're, writing policy wonk techie sort of reports for Friends of the Earth or something, right? We get to feel something about the passion and the joy and the tragedy and the grief. I mean, you feel grief because you love something, right? And the love is at the root of it all. Life is wonderful, so if we can avoid being the last generation, then for fuck's sake, let's make sure that we do. And I started off by saying things are so bad now that we have very little left to lose. But again, to come back to your point, Matt, it seems to me that there is one huge thing that we do have left to lose, and that is our self-respect, right? We will not self-respect. We don't respect ourselves if we don't do everything that we can now to make things better through adaptation, through mitigation, through rebellious action, and so on and so forth. Right? The situation we absolutely do not want to be in is a situation where we can't look our children in the eye in 2035 if it's absolutely clear that everything is going completely to shit. Right? So one thing that we very definitely do have less to lose is our ability to look our kids in the eye and to look ourselves in the mirror and say, I really fucking did everything that I could, and I really tried to share that, and I really tried to make the most of it. And that, I think, is the ultimate thing that should keep us going and might well get us through, but if it doesn't, at least we absolutely bloody tried.
The